there. Today we're going to be talking about qualitative and quantitative methods, some of the theoretical underpinnings and various processes by which we use them. And so these are the two main categories methodologies are divided into. And as we've talked about before and should be fairly self-evident, qualitative tends to be dealing more with qualities, while quantitative deals with quantities. And so if you're dealing more with sort of basic facts or like kind of more interpretive work, you're doing qualitative work. If you're counting things and looking at large numbers, the work you're doing is quantitative. And so the characteristics of research here. Research itself can be described as the systematic investigation into and study of materials and sources in order to establish facts and reach new conclusions. And so this is what research at its heart really is. And so there's many reasons why we do research, and there's many ways to do it. More narrowly, marketing research is done with the investigation with the goal of providing information to be used to guide marketing choices. And so one of the main differences, particularly with the books we use discuss it scholarly versus applied, or basic versus applied. Applied research, you're looking to do something with it. So you're getting actionable information. How to best reach millennial consumers? How do people make decisions about where to buy a car? Right? That's information, if you are a car salesman, that would be useful and helpful. And you would conduct research to find that out. There are two different types of research, as I mentioned. The first one's basic or traditional. I will use the form traditional or scholarly. So this research is academic in nature. It deals with perhaps anthropology or sociology. You're contributing to broad social knowledge. And so the goal of the research, the knowledge that you're producing, is to sort of help us understand society at large and social phenomena. And so we do this for scholarly writing, analyzing social trends, and most importantly, perhaps, guiding public policy decisions. And so when we're looking at what sort of policies might be useful or how to, address a social problem, whether it's poverty, gun violence, or climate change, right, looking at research is a particularly useful, helpful thing to do. And so the results of basic or traditional research are intended to be public. Right, they're conducted with the public interest in mind, and we want to broadly disseminate them. Whereas the other type of research is either applied or proprietary. And so this is conducted in the professional or private sector. You're answering a very specific set of questions and looking to guide the next course of action. And so the results are not intended necessarily to be shared with the public. And so what you're looking at there is Google will not share their results with Bing, right? Because they have an interest in having knowledge that Bing does not have. And so one of the things to keep in mind is that these two types of research are not a binary distinction, but rather they're on a continuum. And so a lot of traditional research has applications in the business world. And similarly, a lot of proprietary research draws on knowledge generated in traditional research. And so there's more in common here than not. And one of these examples is looking at women watching TV. Now, women are a very important demographic for advertisers. Women buy quite a lot of things. They still are the primary purchasers in their home. And so advertisers really are always wondering how to reach women. And what we have on this area right here is information from Nielsen. This was an infographic they created based on some research they had conducted. And AC Nielsen is a private company that conducts market research on consumer demographics. They started off doing audience measurement and have now expanded into other areas as well. But here they're talking about surprising fun facts about what women do with themselves. And so we watch a lot of Walking Dead. More women, surprising amount of women are watching the Sunday Night Football, and so on. And so if you're an advertiser, you might think about, with this information, you might want to think about advertising your product. If your product's aimed at women, or if that's the demographic you're trying to reach, you might look at taking out a Sunday Night Football ad, or perhaps advertise during The Walking Dead. Similarly, looking at how women watch TV, this is a book by Andrea Press that looks at how women interpret the television they watch. And so this book came out in the 1980s. It was a time when we didn't really take television popular culture seriously. And what this book did was really kind of like, she sat down with women, she did qualitative work, and discussed how women watch TV, and kind of took it seriously in terms of what they're using. And you can imagine, if you were writing a television show, understanding how audiences engage with the text and what draws them to be loyal to a particular product is a useful thing. And so we've got to think about the research process. And so what research is, basically, it's the active pursuit of knowledge. And we talked in the last lecture about how knowledge, a lot of it we get passively. We learn it from family, we learn from friends, from the environment around us. But when we're doing research, we're actively looking to answer a question. And that's true whether you're looking for a good restaurant in a new town, or if you're looking to answer a larger, question for a term paper. And so research is the form of disciplined inquiry that involves studying something in a planned manner and reporting it so that other inquirers can potentially replicate the process if they choose. And so what this statement has is quite a few keywords that I highlighted in bold. We have a disciplined inquiry. When we begin the inquiry process, we follow a specific set of steps. And so we're studying something in a planned manner. When you write your final research proposal, you list out the steps that you're going to take. And you're also going to then report on it, because you want people to be able to replicate the process if they choose. And so replication is a very important thought in research and methodology, because we're looking at contributing broad social knowledge, and you want to make sure you don't just have some sort of funny, one-off result. And so we're looking for things that are going to be applicable widely. There's 6 characteristics of research. It's based on questions. That's your first characteristic. So you start with the question. What do you want or need answered? The methods you use then are the strategies to answer these questions. And so how are you collecting the evidence? How are you collecting the information you need to answer your question and then justify your answer to others? Research is also systematic. That's your second characteristic. It proceeds in a step-by-step manner. And it's potentially replicable. And I add that potentially here because when we talk about ethnography and some other qualitative research, replicability becomes less of a measurement. When you're doing statistical work or quantitative work, we're often very interested in replicability. And there's a few reasons for that. Quantitative work emerges out of the so-called hard sciences. And one of the things there, if you're doing medical work, you want to make sure that your drug test results are going to be somewhat universalized, that you can, the 50 people you tested are representative of the population at large, and if you ran the test again on another 50 people, you would have similar results before we prescribe everybody, a new sort of penicillin or something, right? And so you want your conclusions to be reliable, and idiosyncrasies might lead to inappropriate generalizations. Starting that over again, one of the things to think about is that idiosyncrasies, things that are unique to a particular study, can lead to inappropriate generalizations. Our other 3 characteristics of research, research is reflexive and self-critical. And so we're explicit and we're constantly reflecting back on what we've done, what we could do better, and how to make things, how to improve things for the next time we conduct such research. And so you report on your flaws. And oftentimes people want to really kind of bury the limitations of their work. You don't want to do that. Acknowledging the limits of what you've discovered and what else could be done to make the research more valuable and kind of stronger and strengthen your conclusions, you want to acknowledge that, because that lends you credibility and that justifies your work. You're kind of already sort of preempting criticisms by acknowledging the limitations that you've experienced and being reflexive on them. Research is also, it's cumulative. It builds on itself. And so this is one of the things where with traditional or scholarly research, you want to be published, you want to be open, we want to have access to it. So there's a shared history of thought in the field. And so other people can go in, find the work you've done, play with the ideas, and then if they disprove it, if there's incorrect information, it's discredited. The world is not flat. We've moved on from that. We're working with the round world, right? So that thought was, the idea of a flat world was very, hegemonic and uniformly acceptable centuries ago, and now we've moved on to another understanding based on research and experience. And so information accumulates, and research leads to more research. Research is also cyclical. This is sort of the final characteristic. After the study is completed, data is analyzed for potential answers, and then new questions and topics are posed. And so one of the most frustrating things about research that's also the most exciting is that there's always more research to be done. And this is important, especially if you're thinking about doing marketing research or working for a research agency, as I used to. You want to present the results of your initial study, but it's a really good idea to come up with a few other studies that the company would do well by themselves to hire you to complete, right? And so that way you keep yourself in a job. Okay, so there's different types of research cultures, and this is where, again, the differences between qualitative and quantitative come into play. And so research practices are loosely defined along disciplinary lines. If you look in psychology, there's particular research, practices that are orthodox and are used more often than others. Similarly, in biology, you're going to be using different research methods than you would in sociology. And so because the goals of the inquiry, because the questions we're asking and the answers we look for are going to be different depending on the question or the discipline, the appropriate methods and procedures are going to be different. And so we generally divide up scholarly work into physical sciences, that's your physics, your biology, and your chemistry. The humanities, now we're talking history, English, social sciences, sociology, anthropology, economics. Those are all social sciences. And so communication is unique as a discipline because it overlaps all three. And so there's some communication research that deals with like neurological processes in the brain. Some people study eye tracking. So where do our eyes go when we look at a billboard perhaps, or look at an image? What are we drawn to first? We also draw on research methods used in the humanities. We analyze text as if they were books, and we talk about things in that level, and we do historical work. And social sciences, those methodologies are characterized by surveys, by quantitative work as well as qualitative. That's where we also have a lot of work coming on interviews, focus groups, and observation. And so within communications, we can pick and choose between all these disciplines. Another way to think about these processes or these ways of thinking about methods and disciplinary knowledge are as paradigms. And so paradigms are approaches to research. They're worldviews. That's what a paradigm means. And so it's a framework from which we understand human experience. And so they provide a lens through which to view the world, and then information is then interpreted through that lens. And so a paradigm shift we talk about every so often is a shift from one way of thinking to another. And so the Renaissance was a paradigm shift from the medieval era. Modernity and the Industrial Revolution at the turn of the last century, that's a paradigm shift from the agrarian culture that we experienced prior to that. And so the tree on the right here kind of leaves, first principles are basic knowledges, and then we have assumptions, moving up into belief systems. And coming out of this then, what our belief system or paradigm is how we're going to formulate hypothesis. It's going to inform the theories that we use, and finally the knowledge that we create. And so there's three elements to a paradigm. One is the worldview, and the fancy word for that is ontology. The ontological position is basically the worldview that you are approaching. Epistemology is essentially your research methods. These are how we know things, our ways of knowing. And criticisms are the limitations of each paradigm. And so the cartoon on the right, just kind of a very basic spoof on what a paradigm is. You know, imagine seeing the world upright for the first time and all the different bodily functions that change once we begin walking. Now, I'm not saying cavemen ever crawled, but that's just a little humor for you. And so the first paradigm we're going to talk about is that of positivism. And you can think about positivism, the way I tend to remember it is that you are certain of things and that there is one truth, right? I am positive that this is how the world works. And one of the goals of positivism as a worldview, and one of the things is that there is an objective truth, and reality is external to us, and we can discover it. And so the world is knowable and absolute. And so when you're engaging in positive research, or positivists who conduct research, believe in being value-free, that we can abandon our biases and values and find objective, empirical, and knowable truth in the world. The other thing is that objectivity, knowability, and deductive logic are the key principles. And this is probably the model that most of us are taught the hard sciences in, right? This is the thesis, testing, hypothesize, do an experiment, and see the results. And so every rational and justifiable assertion is scientifically verified and is capable of logical proof. And essentially what you're doing when you're doing positivist work in the social sciences is that you're using the same method as the physical sciences to study human behavior. Now, one of the critiques or limitations of this is that humans don't really behave with the rationality and predictability of the natural world, right? We don't grow like trees. We don't interact with the same regularity as something like gravity. And so the application of those methodologies to human behavior can be a little bit tricky and is one of the limitations of positivism. And so within a positive framework, however, your ontology, how we think about reality, is that the social world is like the natural world and made up of law-like universal patterns. And so that means that the conclusions we come to and patterns we discover can be applied across the board, and that human behavior can therefore be explained and predicted. If I behave one way in one situation, other people will behave the same way in the same situation, and I will behave the same way in the next similar situation I encounter. Knowledge is created within a positivist framework through the methods of the natural sciences, so experiments and empirical studies. And again, the critique is that societies don't behave with the relative predictability of the natural world. And I wanted to take a moment and demonstrate sort of what a positivist study would look like. And so this is from the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. And it's a study looking at exposure to violent media. And so this is something within communications we're often very interested in, what the effect of media violence is on us. And so one of the ways that you can read this abstract and why I'm talking about paradigms at the beginning of this course is that once you understand paradigms, it's much easier to interpret the research that the authors have been conducting. And so once we know that this is a positivist paradigm that they're working within, we can judge and investigate their methodologies on those grounds. And so here we have 5 experiments examining the effects of songs with violent lyrics on aggressive thoughts and hostile feelings. So right away, we should be clued in that this is a positivist piece because of the word experiment. And they did several of them, demonstrating that college students who heard a violent song felt more hostile than those who heard a similar but non-violent song. And so we're using, again, social science mimicking the physical sciences, right? Exposure to a variable and then measurement. These effects replicated across songs and song types, and that the song lyrics were effective in raising hostility. And so when they say the discussion centers, this is the part of a research article where they discuss what their findings actually might mean. And so they're concluding here, and this is just judging from the abstract, that the role of lyrics and aggression might be short-term, but it could be cathartic, which means it could be a release. You know, if you play really loud, fast music and you're, kind of running along to it, it's got a cathartic effect. But it might lead to the development of aggressive personality, and they wonder what the differences between long-term and short-term effects are. And now to fully judge the credibility of the article, we'd have to, of course, read it in its entirety. But if you were looking to conduct a study on song lyrics and media violence, this would be a study you might want to look into. But you would be aware that it's a positivist approach. Right, and here again, Craig Anderson is also the author, again, but we've got violent video game effects on aggression, empathy, and pro-social behavior in Eastern and Western countries. And so what they've done here, when they say meta-analytic review, we're looking at they're looking at a bunch of different studies and looking at them for effects across the board. And so, again, though, we can tell that this is a positivist approach because they're using social cognition models. They're looking to apply it universally, and they're using theoretical predictions to discuss things. Right, and this is actually a hard science article. It's coming from the Journal of Natural Sciences. But you can see some of the similarities if you take the time to read the abstracts. The language and how the abstract is organized is similar to the ones that we just discussed. And so an experiment was conducted. The implications are this. We could allow law enforcement to use multispectral data, and so on and so forth. Our second paradigm today is a naturalistic paradigm. It's also called social constructionist or interpretive. I often use social constructionist or interpretive when I discuss it. Those are the terms I use in my own research. But some of the books and readings call it naturalistic. And so we can float between all three. I want to put them all up there so that you know that they refer essentially to the same paradigm. The key tenet of this paradigm is that reality is socially constructed. So we create reality ourselves. And this, of course, does not mean that we can create reality willy-nilly, but that our social realities are made in concert with each other. And so we need to think about the context of human interaction when we conduct our research on human society. And so we develop methods that capture the socially constructed and situated nature of human behavior. And so to think about the example I gave of the baby colors, it might seem a little bit silly, but it's sort of an innocuous way of beginning to think about the assumptions we make about whether it's gendered behavior or behavior based on age, and so on and so forth, that those are socially constructed by and large, that they're created, and we can look at other societies and find different norms within them. And so the assumption is that social context and interaction frame our realities. And so it emphasizes the social in social science. And the way it approaches truth is that it doesn't have a capital T. A capital T truth is like a universal law-like truth. Truth in a social constructionist way is varying. It's socially constructed and ever-changing. And so one example would be the meaning of hand gestures. That varies among cultures. The ontology for a naturalistic or social constructionist paradigm is that the social world is different from the natural world. It's a world made up of meaning. And so one of the things that social constructionists are really interested in is how meaning is made in society. And so meaning isn't inherent in any one thing. Diamonds are perhaps my favorite example of this. They're not rare. They're not particularly useful as jewelry. So why do we have them, and why are they the standard engagement ring? And that's actually, we've given them meaning. That meaning's very real, but it also is a result of a particular historical process. And I'll add a video about that later. Now, the epistemology of social constructionists, you're using methods to get at the meaning of social practices. So what does it mean to have diamonds as engagement rings or as a particularly valuable object? Why have we imbued them with these meanings? And so you can use qualitative or quantitative methods to understand this: surveys, ethnography, or interviews. And the general critique of social constructivism is that it's not scientific. And so here's where questions about generalizability or replicability come into place. And so because it is rooted in a belief that meaning is made socially, social context is incredibly important. And so it's difficult to make large claims about the world at large because we have to contextualize things in their proper place and time. And so an example of an abstract that emphasizes a social constructionist point of view: good news for the future, young people, internet use, and political participation. And so some things to highlight here, if we're thinking about how to discover what paradigm the author's using, would be that they're looking at meaning, right? How do young people engage in political participation? And they're talking about differential media use. And so they're doing somewhat of it's a quantitative study. They're using a national survey, but they're not really making a universal claim here. They're rejecting the predictive power of duration of media use, but saying that the type of media use is very important. And so their conclusion is where this, you can really tell. The research demonstrates how a wider and more contemporary conception of political participation, together with more detailed measures of media use, can help gain better insight into the roles media can play. And so they're really interested here, although they're doing a survey and doing quantitative work, they're interested in getting at the meaning of media use in engaging in political participation. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind when looking at paradigms, right? The meaning is what they're looking at. How are people interpreting the world around them and using social tools? Another example comes from Communication Research in 2000, Race and the Misrepresentation of Victimization in Local TV News. And so what the authors did here, they looked at a random sample of television news aired in Los Angeles and Orange County, and looked at how whites, blacks, and Latinos were represented as crime victims. And then they did intergroup comparisons. And so this is content analysis. They watched TV and they counted the occurrences and the qualities of the occurrences. But it's a quantitative study because they're counting. And so what they found is that, they looked at underrepresentation and overrepresentation compared to sociological data about crime. And here again, we've got a content analysis of a random sample of Los Angeles television news programs and looking at racial representations of perpetrators, victims, and officers. And so we can tell that these two studies are social constructionist in nature and interpretive because, again, they're getting at meaning. And they're not saying that because this is the result, right, that the TV news puts, over-represents African Americans as criminals, while over-representing whites as victims and officers, that is the reality, or that creates a one-to-one ratio, right, of representation and then influence on audiences. They're looking at the meaning and how this impacts ethnic blame discourse, incognizant racism, structural limitations, and guard dog perspectives of news media. And our final paradigm is the critical paradigm. And the critical paradigm has a particular social justice bend to it. It's focused on power, inequality, and social change, one of the really important things to remember here is that this informs the questions you ask and not how you go about the research. Once you ask your questions because you're oriented towards a critical framework, but once you enter the research, you're as value neutral as possible. You're still interested in the question, but you cannot only pick and choose the data you want to prove the point you want to make. And so one of the central tenets of critical work is the belief that power, inequality, and change shape reality and social truth. And so critical researchers are social constructivists and interpretivists in that they believe social reality is co-created by society. But we also believe that social science can never be truly objective or value-free, that we're always going to carry our own sort of baggage and perspective with us. And that science investigation should be conducted with the express goal of social change in mind. And so you look at social problems and you think about how do we address those and sort of uncover what is happening to lead to a more inclusive society. So the ontology, the way that the worldview, how we see reality from a critical paradigm, is that we can discern patterns in our social world, but these are man-made and therefore can be changed. Meanwhile, the epistemology, it's similar to that of interpretivist or naturalistic research, but we also include texts and historical documents. It's exclusively qualitative and never experimental. And so if you're looking at an experiment, you know from the start that we are not looking at critical work. We often try to show patterns of inequality and how they changed over time. So we look for, the other thing that critical research often does is look at sources of conventional knowledge and think about how we might transform learning and society. And so one of the things to remember is students often get turned off by the term critical, thinking that that means that you have to really hate or dislike something. But it doesn't refer to being negative or disliking something. It simply means that you're thinking about it actively. And so you can have a critical reading of a television show you like a lot. I did my master's thesis. It was a critical audience study of Sex and the City. And so it was critical in that it really unpacked the sort of gender norms and ideas about consumption that Sex and the City as a television show brought forward, as well as what it was saying about women, single women in society and feminism. And then I interviewed audience members to ask about their opinions and thoughts on it. And so was kind of tacking back and forth between what the audience was getting from the show and then a critical reading of the show itself and of broader social discourse around women, around single women in their late 20s. And so the critique of critical research is that it is unscientific, which it indeed is. And so some examples of critical work on how we might tell from just an abstract what paradigm it is. The death narratives of revitalization, colonial governance, China, and the reconfiguration of the Hong Kong film industry. And so here we're looking at the repercussions of colonial and post-colonial governance for the film industry. This is going to be a critical project, basically because we're working with looking at the interaction between media and larger social pressures. And there's an interest in thinking about the post-colonial condition. And so these combine to kind of uncover and like kind of unearth normative assumptions that we might have about how the film industry operates. You can tell from the abstract that it's very historically situated and that it doesn't kind of assume normativity. It's very situated within its social and geographic context. Another example would be this, fetishizing flow, constructing retail space and flexible gendered labor in digital era insurance advertising. And so this right here, the authors tell us that they're critically analyzing the progressive insurance campaign with the character Flo. And they're looking for how the campaign uses women as a commodity and nostalgically represents retail spaces and workers. And so, you know, how does this commercial reflect larger social changes with the understanding that that then we can kind of, if we understand it, we can intervene and sort of change the things that don't seem socially just about it. And so those are your 3 research paradigms. I want you to really take a moment and review them. They will be coming up on your exam and are going to be really helpful ways of thinking about engaging with research and reading research when you begin to do your secondary work. Thank you.